All right, we take it everybody has the lesson, and so we'll need to look at that. We're going to turn first of all to Deuteronomy chapter 27. If we'll just turn there, and we'll get there in just a little bit. But on your notes, we're going to be studying this morning Joshua's great witness stone at Shechem. Now, there's a couple of verses that I don't have on the notes that we want you to make a note of on the notes, but you'll see there's several graphics on here. I want you to turn your attention also onto the back page. We're going to be looking this morning at Joshua's great witness stone. And this is right there today, if you were to go to the West Bank, the modern city of Nablus, which is the Palestinian authority, controls that city. But this is the ancient city of Shechem. And if you turn over to the back page, on the top left, Tel Balta, or Balata, I guess you would call that, but that's where this ancient site is that we're going to be studying today, and where the stone that Joshua erected is still there. To the right of that, you will see Joseph's tomb, and then to the bottom, right-hand corner at the bottom, you have Jacob's well. And so I just want to go through very briefly some of the things that took place at this city called Shechem. So the word Shechem means shoulder. And you'll notice in that big picture on page 1 that the Shechem's in the valley between two quite large mountains to the south and to the north. The valley basically runs west to east. And so Mount Gerizim is on the south. And this was known as the Mount of Blessings, and you'll understand this in just a moment. And the mountain to the north is Mount Elba. And then, so these two mountains, as you look at it, it's almost like if you're looking at the shoulders of maybe of an animal, the front shoulders. And so that's what the name Shechem means. Now, Shechem also was a person, and you remember Shechem defiled Dinah, Jacob's daughter. And Simeon and Levi went in there and they killed everybody. But the place was called Shechem really for hundreds and hundreds of years. Now, some of the things that happened in Shechem, we just noted them here in this first paragraph. When Abraham first came into the land, the first place he landed was Shechem. And that's where he built an altar to the Lord. And that's where the Lord promised him about his seed. And then from Shechem, then he went to Bethel. And then when Jacob first came in, after he wrestled with the angel at Penuel, he came on in, he crossed over the Jordan, and he came up to Shechem as well. Now Shechem is where Jacob's first altar was in Canaan as well. And by the way, keep your place there in Deuteronomy chapter 27. I didn't put this one in. Look at Genesis 35, but this is really important, because Shechem is a place where many covenants were made, promises. God makes promises to Abraham. Jacob makes promises to God. We're going to find here this has a connection with Joseph as well, and of course Israel. But in Genesis 35, verse 1, God said unto Jacob, Arise, go up to Bethel, and dwell there. Well, where was he when God told him that? Well, he was at Shechem. Verse 2, then Jacob said to his household, to all that were with him, Put away the strange gods that are among you, and be clean, and change your garments. So he's talking to his sons here. Before they go to Bethel, they're still in Shechem, and they had picked up idols while they were over with Uncle Laban. And so they had to get rid of some stuff. Look at verse 3. And let us arise and go up to Bethel, and I will make there an altar unto God, who answered me in the day of my distress, and was with me in the way which I went. Now verse 4. And they gave unto Jacob all the strange gods which were in their hand, and all their earrings which were in their ears, and Jacob hid them under the oak which was by Shechem. Now, again, we're introduced here to Shechem and this oak tree. Now, this oak tree, by the time we get to the end of the story, is several hundred years old. And this stone that Joshua was going to erect, he erects under the shadow of this tree. Shechem, the same tree, I would suppose, that Jacob. So here's a covenant. They're getting things right with God in this place called Shechem. So Joseph, now we're not going to look at all these, don't have the time, but Joseph was sold at Shechem because his brothers were feeding the flocks at Shechem, and Jacob tells Joseph to go to his brethren, and so he goes and he meets them at Shechem, and that's where they sell him. And so Joseph goes into slavery at Shechem. He's sold, and he goes down into Egypt. Now when Joseph dies, and then they come back up, and Joseph's bones are brought back into the land of Israel, they're buried in Shechem. In fact, the tomb is still there if you go today. Joseph's tomb. So he was sold there, and then he came back to Shechem. The covenant was made, and this is a little bit of an error here. The covenant was made at Shechem. That's Joshua chapter 8, and it was also renewed under Joshua in Joshua 24, and that's a passage we'll need to write down as well. So the covenant, when the children of Israel went into the land of Israel, God had them to gather at Shechem, and 6 tribes were on Mount Gerizim, and they were to bless, they were to pronounce the blessings upon Israel for their obedience, and 6 of the tribes went north on Mount Ebal, and they were to recite the cursings upon Israel if they were to disobey God, and this was a very visual way for the people of Israel, once they had gone into the land, to remind themselves of the covenant promises of God and their covenant promises to the God of Israel. Now we also find on later on that the rebel Abimelech was crowned king by the citizens of Shechem. Now Abimelech was the son of Gideon, or Jerubbaal, and he went out and killed 70 of his stepbrothers, half-brothers, and he was given the money to do that by the people who were, I think I mentioned it down here, the temple of Baal-berith. They provided 70 pieces of silver, so 1 piece of silver for each of Abimelech's brothers, and so he wipes out his whole family line, and God brings judgment upon those people because of that, and also, of course, upon Abimelech. But that happens at this very same place in Shechem. So they crown Abimelech king at Shechem. This is during the time of the judges, before the time of the kings, so this was illegitimate. And then Rehoboam, son of Solomon, was crowned king at Shechem. So obviously he ended up in Jerusalem, but he was crowned king at Shechem. And then also Shechem became the first capital of the northern kingdom established by Jeroboam during the time of the divided kingdom. Ends up being in Samaria, but initially it was at Shechem. And then interestingly, Jesus met a woman at the well. The woman at the well in the city of Sychar is Shechem. And that's why you have the third site on there, which is Jacob's well. So Jacob's well, remember she says, you say Jerusalem is the place to worship, when we say this is the place to worship, this is the mountain. And Jesus said, it'll neither be here nor there, but God is a spirit, they that worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. Well, let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 27, please. Now, this stone that we're going to look at in the video today, it's called a Mazabah stone. Now, these were stones. You remember when we looked at the Canaanite city, the Amorites, the judgment on the Amorites, and they were burning their babies, and they had those standing stones. So the Canaanite had these standing stones, and so it was associated with paganism, and it was condemned. But also, the Lord used this. The Israelites also had these standing, and some of these stones were actually commanded of the Lord. And you remember when Jacob saw the ladder at Bethel, and he slapped upon a stone as a pillow. They would light a fire and warm that stone up, and they would lie on the stone. That kept the heat during the night. And the next day he got up and he lifted that stone up as a pillar and he anointed it with oil. Well, that's a Mazabah. And so we find that here in Deuteronomy. So let's look down at, look at verse 1. And Moses with the elders of Israel commanded the people, saying, keep all the commandments which I command you this day. And it shall be on the day when ye shall pass over Jordan unto the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, that thou shalt set thee up great stones, and plaster them with plaster, And thou shalt write upon them all the words of this law when thou art passed over, that thou mayest go in unto the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, a land that floweth with milk and honey, as the Lord thy God of thy fathers hath promised thee. Therefore it shall be, when ye are gone over Jordan, that ye shall set up these stones which I command you this day in Mount Ebal. So Moses even tells them where this is going to happen. And thou shalt plaster them with plaster, and there thou shalt build an altar unto the Lord thy God, an altar of stones. Thou shalt not lift up any iron tool upon them. Thou shalt build the altar of the Lord thy God with whole stones. Verse 8, thou shalt write upon the stones all the words of this law very plainly. And there's different kinds of stones. When they built an altar, it was not to be hewn stones. They're not to shape the stones. You just take natural stones, pile them up, and that would be the altar. But you see also in verse 2, he talks about the stone being set up and then it being plastered, and then they would write the law upon those stones. So there's two different kinds of things here. So look over at Joshua chapter 8. Now once, you'll notice this is picking up right after the battle of Ai, which we looked at last time. Joshua chapter 8. And you remember we left off in verse 29 with a great heap of stones upon the king that had been hung upon a pole. And then in verse 30, then Joshua built an altar unto the Lord God of Israel in Mount Ebal. So there were only two battles in. They fought the battle of Jericho. They fought the battle of Ai. And then they went directly north, which is like a 1 day, maybe a 1.5 day journey from Ai. Maybe they probably went back to Gilgal down in the Jordan Valley. But it's only maximum 2 day journey to Shechem. Now here's the interesting thing. When we talked about the Armana letters, that the king of Jabus, or Jerusalem, when he was writing to the Egyptian Pharaoh, he was complaining that they were like a boat in the sea, that the Habaru had come in, and but he complained because the king of Shechem didn't fight. Shechem handed the land over. There's no battle recorded for Shechem. That's secular history. And so here we have Joshua going to Shechem, and he's building the altar, and he's going to set up this stone of covenant. Now, in chapter 8, look at verse 32. He wrote there upon the stones a copy of the law of Moses, which he wrote in the presence of all the children of Israel. Now, we have the reference there. You're just going to have to read it for yourself. But more importantly, look at Joshua chapter 24. At the end of the conquest, at the end of Joshua's life, he makes them rededicate to the covenant. And so what does he do? Well, he brings them to that place of covenant, to Shechem. Verse 1, Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem and called for all the elders of Israel, for their heads and their judges, for their officers, and they presented themselves before God. So this is now just before Joshua dies. And this is when he, the great words, if it seem evil unto you to serve the Lord, choose you this day whom you will serve. And they say, no, we will serve the Lord. And they meant it, by the way. And that whole generation did serve the Lord. But notice down in verse number 26. And Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God, and took a great stone. Now this is the stone you're going to see in the video. And he took a great stone and set it up there under an oak. Now remember Jacob? The oak's still there. This oak is hundreds of years old. That's not... when we went to Mamre, it was the place where Jacob had his tent, and the great oaks. Now, they're not there today. I wonder what the land of milk and honey would have looked like during the time of the patriarchs and during the time of the conquest. We look at Israel and say it's a barren place. They've done a whole lot with it. But when Jesus comes, he's going to do a whole lot with it as well. He's going to restore all of that glory. But this oak was there. That was by the sanctuary of the Lord. And Joshua said unto all the people, behold, this stone shall be a witness unto us, for it hath heard all the words of the Lord, which he spake unto us. It shall be therefore a witness unto you, lest ye deny your God. So he set this stone up as a witness that they had made this promise to the Lord. And they kept the promise until they all died out. New generation come, and they defiled it. And actually this stone of witness, the stone of promise, became an idolatrous stone. And they built an idolatrous temple right beside this thing. And it's just a way of man, isn't it? They start out good and they have a relationship with God, and then all of a sudden they're into paganism and idolatry, and God brings judgment upon them. We don't have time to look at this. He'll mention it. Judges chapter 9. We're going to look at the stone again and the temple that is there. Like I said, it's in the story of Abimelech, the son of Gideon. and what he did to his sons or his brothers, and then really what he did to the people who rebelled against him. All right, so I know I just don't have enough time to get into all of this, but the notes there, the scriptures are there for the most part. But do remember Genesis 35, 1-4, and also Joshua 24, 26, and 27. And you can read those a little later. All right, at this time we're going to show the video.
So I'm standing in the ruins of ancient Shechem.
The greatest moments in biblical archaeology are when you have something that is described in the Bible, and then that very thing is dug up and found through archaeology. This is the story of just such a discovery. This stone is in the Bible.
That's amazing! That just blows my mind.
So it really helps me and my team if you're willing to hit that subscribe button. I'll leave a link in the description where you can order a copy of my book, Where God Came Down, the Archaeological Evidence. Thanks for making it #1 in archaeology. I'll also leave a link for anyone that's interested in leaving a donation. These really help in the production of future videos. Located in the heart of the Bible's Promised Land, about 35 miles north of Jerusalem are two large mountains. Mount Gerizim is the southernmost of the two, while Mount Ebal is just to the north. In Deuteronomy chapter 27, Moses is instructing the Israelites about what they are to do when they enter the land of Canaan. Moses names 6 tribes, commanding that these tribes shall stand on Mount Gerizim to bless the people. Moses then names 6 more tribes, saying, "And these tribes shall stand on Mount Ebal to pronounce curses." This event takes place in Joshua chapter 24 with the covenant renewal at Shechem, when Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem. The city of Shechem is located in the valley between Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, and its ancient mound, known locally as Tel Balata, was first excavated by the Germans under the directorship of Ernst Sellen, who began in 1913 by digging along a large section of the city wall. In 1926, Sellen unearthed what he described as a water trough cut out of a gigantic rock. In it lay transversely a monolith.
In 1926, the German archaeologist Ernst Sellen was excavating right in this area, and he unearthed this massive stone here. He saw that it was a carved stone. It's not complete. It would have stood quite tall back in ancient times when it was complete, but he saw that this was and interpreted it as a sacred standing stone called a matzebah in Hebrew. When Sellen excavated the sacred standing stone at Shechem, he found it broken. We're at a different Canaanite city, and we have this sacred Canaanite standing stone that is intact, and this lets us know what that Shechem standing stone would have looked like in ancient times. He also found right in the same area this massive stone with a trough carved into the top of it. And he interpreted that to be a watering trough for animals. This was 1926. In 1928, he continued to find these types of stones, but he began to question his interpretation because if you see this slot here, it wouldn't be able to hold water. And so he wondered if maybe he had misinterpreted it. And he continued to find these. So you can see from this stone here why he would have thought originally that this was a watering trough. However, he found another standing stone next to this one, and all of a sudden he got an idea. And he had his men lift up the sacred stone and then put it into this trough. And it fit perfectly. And that's when he realized that these were not watering troughs. They were the foundational stone bases to these sacred stones so that they could stand upward. So then, once he realized that, he went back to the largest of the sacred stones that he had found in his excavations in 1926, this one, and this giant base that he had originally thought was a watering trough. It's underneath here right now, and he had his men lift this huge stone and put it into that base, and again, the two fit perfectly. And so we have In this area, this largest, most predominant sacred standing stone and its base.
This picture was taken of Selland's excavations in 1926. It shows the huge stone that Selland found, and in front of it were the remains of an altar covered with the bones from sacrifices. And then in front of this was the entrance into a monumental building that Selland identified as a temple.
So when Selland was excavating in this area, another thing that he found was a sacrificial altar right here, where sacrifices were made, and all of this was right in front of a massive temple. And the entrance of that temple is right here.
So the workmen for Selland's excavation came across these sacred stones and they didn't know what they were, and so they broke them up with a sledgehammer. And so there were sacred stones standing on the north and south of the entrance to the temple. The one on the north was completely destroyed and is missing to this day. The one on the southern side of the entrance, Selland came along as the workmen were breaking this stone up, and he only managed to salvage the very bottom of that sacred stone, which you can see today at the site in its base. Based on the archaeology and top plans from excavation reports, the temple can be reconstructed. The massive sacred stone stood before the altar that was in front of the temple entrance, where two additional sacred stones stood on either side. The inside of the temple building was divided into two rooms.
So this is the entrance of this temple that comes back in this first room. Then we have pillars across here, and then we have the backside of this temple and massive walls all the way around. Now, this temple is often referred to as a fortress temple or even a tower temple. And the reason why is because of how massive its walls are. These walls of a building, keep in mind, this is the inner part of that wall, and they go all the way over here, roughly 17 feet to the outer part of the wall. These are as big or bigger than the actual city walls of Shechem. Now, it's understood in archaeology that the broadness of a wall has to do with how tall that building is. And so it's understood here from the archaeologists that this was a multi-storied building that these massive wide walls supported. And so that's why you sometimes read about this temple as being a tower temple.
This reconstruction drawing from a later Shechem excavation report shows the temple being 4 stories tall. As a member of the German team that was digging at Shechem was Dr. Gabriel Welter, and he believed that this monumental building was a fortress. And so when Selland changed his interpretation that these were water troughs and over to these are the bases of sacred stones and that this is a temple, then Welter had a very strong reaction to that. He was completely against that. Not only did Selland believe that this was a sacred stone and a temple, but he believed that this was the very sacred stone and temple that is described in the Bible in the book of Judges in chapters 8 and 9. And so I'll get to how that interpretation was made by Selland and the evidence for it. But before we do, we need to understand this escalation of the conflict on this excavation between Selland and Welter. In fact, Welter was away from the site when Selland set these sacred stones up in their bases, and he was actually doing a power play where he managed to oust Selland from being the director of the dig. And so when Welter returned to Shechem and to the excavation, then Selland was out, and Welter was now in charge as the new director of the dig. What happened next was written down by Dr. Schmidt, a scholar associated with the dig. Schmidt wrote, "A few weeks later, Dr. Welter arrived and was furious to see the erected matzebahs. He had them therefore taken out of their sockets and thrown down the slope of the fill."
This was the case, then Welter toppled this sacred stone. He was very disgusted with the interpretation, which was a biblical interpretation. He totally disagreed with it, so he toppled the sacred stone and took the sacred stone and the stone base to that stone and hurled them off of this platform down into the square that Selin had earlier dug, which is east of the temple.
Another witness to this was the renowned American archaeologist W.F. Albright, who wrote, "I was then in Palestine and saw the stone after it had been set up by Selin where it had been found, and also after Welter had dumped it into the neighboring trench. It was broken further in the process." It becomes all the more disturbing what Welter did when we go to the Bible and realize how significant this stone that was damaged further by Welter is. This stone is in the Bible. In Judges chapters 8 and 9 we read, "No sooner had Gideon died than the Israelites again prostituted themselves to the Baals. They set up Baal-berith as their god and did not remember the Lord their God. The citizens of Shechem were inclined to follow Abimelech, for they said, 'He is related to us.' They gave him 70 shekels of silver from the temple of Baal-berith. Then all the citizens of Shechem and Beth Milo gathered beside the great tree at the pillar in Shechem to crown Abimelech king." So how much more clear can the evidence for the Bible be than here at Shechem? I mean, you're talking about Judges 8 and 9, talking about this pillar of Shechem, this sacred stone, and this temple. And then Selin comes along and excavates, and what does he find? He finds this pillar of Shechem, this sacred stone with the temple associated with it. Not only this, but it dates to the same time period as Judges chapters 8 and 9, which is the 12th century BC. So we have a match in date, we have a match in what was found, and we have this amazing correlation at Shechem between the Bible and the archaeology. What Selin found at Shechem is a great example of how biblical archaeology works. If you take the Bible out of it, then what do we know about this building? What do we know about these stones? Very, very little. It's when you bring the Bible in that all of a sudden these stones come to life, because you know the events that surround these stones. You know what happened in this building. You know the name of this building. If you didn't have the biblical text, then you would look at this temple and this stone and you would think Canaanite. But when you look at what the text says, keep in mind, this is not a Canaanite standing stone. It says in the text that the Israelites set up a god named Baal-berith, and the temple was for the worship of this god. This is not a Canaanite temple. This is an Israelite temple. And Abimelech is the son of Gideon. He's an Israelite, and he's crowned king next to this sacred stone. And so are we to think of Abimelech as the first king of Israel, that the temple at Shechem is the first temple in Israel? No, because this is a false god, and therefore it's an illegitimate temple and an illegitimate king. And this is why Abimelech is killed, and before that, this is why the temple, this Israelite temple that's illegitimate, is destroyed by fire. In Judges 9, Abimelech turns against the citizens of Shechem, and it says, "On hearing this, the citizens in the tower of Shechem went into the stronghold of the temple of El-berith. When Abimelech heard that they had assembled there, so all the men cut branches and followed Abimelech. They piled them against the stronghold and set it on fire with the people still inside. So all the people in the tower of Shechem, about 1,000 men and women, also died." When Selin was excavating this temple at Shechem, he got to the destruction layer within that temple, which was this massive burn layer. This temple had been destroyed by fire, just as the Bible describes. After the Germans finished their excavations, beginning in 1956, a new excavation started called the Drew McCormick excavations, and these were mainly directed by the well-known biblical archaeologist G. Ernest Wright. Now, the layer of the temple that was destroyed by fire, Wright called that Temple 2B, and he agreed with Selin that this is the temple that is in Judges chapters 8 and 9. Not only that, but he also agreed with him about the date of that temple, that it dated to the 12th century BC, which is the same time period as the events that happen in the book of Judges chapters 8 and 9. So G. Ernest Wright followed the interpretations and agreed with the interpretations of Selin and rejected the interpretations of Welter. Wright wrote, "From the Abimelech story is the statement that within the city there was a temple, the house of El-Berith, which was also destroyed. The reference here, without serious question, is to the structure which we have designated Temple 2B. In Judges 9, therefore, we have a most important correlation between the archaeological discoveries and biblical tradition." Ernest Wright and his team called the largest sacred standing stone that Selin found Matzeba 1, and he wrote of it, "The tradition about Joshua's great stone is probably related to Matzeba 1. Wright's excavation staff members Edward Campbell and James Ross agreed when they wrote, "As for this pillar, it is most probably the Matzeba of the late Bronze Temple, and if so, identical with Joshua's great stone." These scholars associated with the Drew McCormick excavation not only agreed with Ernst Selin and his interpretation that this is the sacred stone talked about in the book of Judges, but they also believed that since it was the one that was in the book of Judges, it also is the very identical stone, Joshua stone, that is discussed in Joshua chapter 24. In Joshua 24, Joshua said to the people, "You are not able to serve the Lord. He is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your rebellion and your sins. If you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, he will turn and bring disaster on you and make an end of you after he has been good to you." And the people said to Joshua, "We will serve the Lord our God and obey him." Then he took a large stone and set it up, there under the oak near the holy place of the Lord. "See," he said to the people, "this stone will be a witness against us. It will be a witness against you if you are untrue to your God." In Deuteronomy 27, Moses commands the Israelites, "You shall set up large stones and plaster them with plaster. And you shall write on them all the words of this law when you cross over to enter the land the Lord your God is giving you." When you look at the stone that Selin found, unfortunately it's broken, but the large portion that remains, you can see how intricately it's carved. It was carved to stand upright, and it's been intentionally smoothed. And so it makes sense that the reason for that is so that it could be plastered with plaster and that it could be written on. This is how it's the witness stone. It's got the covenant written on it, the laws of the covenant. So in the future, if an Israelite wants to know more about the covenant that he's part of, then he can go back to Shechem, the place where the covenant was renewed, and he can go to the witness stone and see the terms of the agreement between Yahweh and Israel written on that stone. The interpretation of Wright and his team was based on the obvious correlations between Joshua chapter 24 and the later events covered in Judges chapters 8 and 9. In Joshua 24, at Shechem, Joshua took a large stone and set it up under an oak near the holy place of the Lord. Centuries later, the pillar in Shechem is described beside the great tree at a temple called both Baal-Berith and El-Berith. In Hebrew, Berith means covenant. Baal means Lord, and El means God. Therefore, the names of the temple at Shechem means Lord of the Covenant and God of the Covenant. Despite the meaning of the name Baal-Berith, it is not to be confused with the true covenant God of Israel, because it's said of the Israelites that they prostituted themselves when they set up Baal-Berith as their God, and that they did not remember the Lord their God. And this, amazingly, is the stone that Selin found in his excavations at Shechem. I mean, this is just what it's all about, that we could read something in the Bible, read about something specific like a sacred stone, and then all these thousands of years later, somewhere around 3,400 years later, we can come here to Shechem and dig and find and see the actual stone that is being talked about in Joshua chapter 24, that was a witness to the covenant that was renewed here between Yahweh and the Israelites in Shechem. I mean, that's amazing!
That just blows my mind.
How significant is this stone that is in the Bible in multiple places? And so now it becomes all the more disturbing to realize that Dr. Welter damaged this stone further when he took it from its original place where it was found and hurled it down into a deep pit. Dr. Wright wrote, "And that was where we found them, and with great difficulty and rented equipment managed to drag Matsuba 1 and its socket back on top of the reconstructed court. We set them up again."
So I am standing in a hole east of the temple. This is where Dr. Welter threw the sacred stone in its base. In 1960, the archaeologist G. Ernest Wright found this stone and its base down here and realized how significant this sacred stone was. It's a stone that's in the Bible. And so he started a salvage project to get this sacred stone in its base out of this hole and back up to the original place where it had been discovered in 1926 by Sellin. They put the base down and were able to heave the rock back up and put it in its base and then cement it in. And as you can see, it stands here to this day. So one thing that's interesting to me about this sacred stone that is mentioned in the Bible is that it's found broken. And this is fitting because think about what it says in the Bible about this stone. In Joshua 24, Joshua sets it up because the Israelites are making a covenant with the Lord that they will worship Him and obey Him alone. And then just a few centuries later in Judges chapter 9, what are the Israelites doing? They're actually worshiping the witness stone as a false god. It's a broken witness stone to a broken covenant.
This stone that is still standing at Shechem to this day, even though it's got spray paint on it, man. Anyways, the stone that's standing there to this day really represents and shows how biblical archaeology works. Without the Bible, we wouldn't know anything about it. Nobody would care. With the Bible, we have this historical portrait of what has happened to this stone down through the years and how it connects to the biblical account. And it becomes something truly profound. It's not looking at the ruins at Shechem that makes you go, wow. It's actually the Bible and what it has to say about it. And then the realization that this evidence is left behind from those events that makes you go, wow. So what is the archaeological test for the reliability of the Bible? Well, a main one is that when we have details that are in the biblical description that are then found, those very things, in the excavations at a site, and we have this perfect match between the Bible and what it says and the archaeology that was found, then that shows the reliability of Scripture. You have the Bible as history because back at the time when these events are happening, it's telling you what happened, and then the things that have been left behind from those events are then dug up and found through archaeology. This is biblical archaeology. That's why biblical archaeology is made up of two words, Bible and archaeology. This is how they work together. And what was found by Sellin in the excavations of Shechem, especially in the sacred standing stone, is a perfect example of that.
All of us inside are broken, and we need to be restored. And the only Israelite that ever lived his life perfectly in covenant with the Lord is the Messiah, Yeshua, Jesus in English. And so Jesus is the one who came and died for us so that our sins and our unfaithfulness could be forgiven, so that we could be restored into right relationship with God.
Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I'll leave a link where you can order a copy of my book, Where God Came Down, the Archaeological Evidence. I'll also leave a link where any of you that might be interested in giving a donation to the production of future videos, that would be greatly appreciated and helpful. Also, for any of you that are interested in studying biblical archaeology from a Bible worldview, then I highly recommend a program at Shepherd's Theological Theological Seminary for you to do that. And so I'll leave a link in the description for that as well. You can watch another video here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Well, I thought that was a pretty good video this morning. Enjoyed studying. And we didn't get to all the verses, but you have it there that you can kind of look at those scriptures and read it for yourself. And again, these are all online. The expeditionbible.com. You can go on there and look at it on YouTube. And so as we're going through the biblical timeline and history, we're going to be following. There's some more from Joshua. Later on, we'll be getting into the geography and archaeology of Babylon, and also Nineveh, and Lachish, and then we'll be coming into the New Testament times, and we'll be looking at several things concerning Jerusalem and other things as well. But I just love this study. I'm learning a lot from it, things that I'd never known before, and that's, been at this for 40-something years, so it's very interesting.